digital age, spanning things like the use of technologies for work-life balance and how to maintain and optimize productivity. And she's also done extensive research on digital games, including games for post-work recovery, immersion, and serious games. Anna is heavily involved in both the Chi and Chi Play committees and has also served as a select advisor for the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee on Immersive and Addictive Technologies. And she's here today to talk to us about games for surviving our PhDs. So welcome, Anna.
Thank you very much. I've usefully just had a message pop up saying that my connection is unstable. So I hope we get through this, but if not, I don't know what's going to happen. Okay, so I'll jump straight in. I guess thinking about the title that I've set as Games for Surviving Your PhD, in fact, I want to really argue that you should be playing games, not just researching them, but really playing them if you want to excel at your PhD. So that's kind of like the message that I hope I'm going to give you. And to do that, I'm going to tell you trying to give you two different reasons based on some of my research as to why I think you should be doing that. So first of all, doing a PhD is hard, right? Being a PhD student is really, really challenging. And part of that is because there are just so many things to do. You're trying to work out what it really means to do novel research and then try and do some and do that well, and then work out how to write that up properly. And at the same time, become part of an academic community and maybe also be involved in teaching and public engagement and working with industry. And as if that wasn't bad enough to have all of those different things to cope with, increasingly we see this trend to use metrics to gauge how well students are doing on all of these things. So we end up counting the number of studies that we've run or the number of chapters we've written, how many talks we've given, how many jobs we've applied for, how many job offers we've collected. And there's just a huge amount of pressure from being put on these sort of leaderboards. And that, I think, has contributed a great deal to the high rates of mental ill health that we see in our PhD student cohorts. And then we've had the last 18 months and things have got even worse. So as a result of the pandemic, many students have had to find new ways of doing their research. So pivoting overnight from collecting data in a lab to trying out how to do that remotely. And in many ways, those students are the lucky ones because some others haven't been able to gather data at all without the possibility of traveling or being in a university lab. So, and on top of that, we have the whole uncertainty and scariness of the whole situation just made it an incredibly stressful time. So I think really it's no surprise that many PhD students are finding things really, really difficult right now. So in this talk, I want to cover three strands of my research and cover some of the struggles that we know people have experienced, particularly over the last 18 months, and then give you two reasons why I think games can help us deal with some of those struggles. And in particular, how they might help us to create strong working relationships with our colleagues and how they help us to cope with work-related stress. So, in addition to conducting research on aspects of game experience, I've long been interested in understanding how people use technology to get their work done and the role that mobile technologies in particular place in blurring the boundaries between work and home. So when the pandemic hit last year and it seemed like much of the world implemented social distancing regulations, which meant that we all had to stay at home and work from home if we could, this was actually like in secret, although a bit nervous, I was also super excited because I just thought this is going to be a great opportunity to look at remote work and how people cope with this whole situation. So, and I think at the same time, I kind of felt like actually, I know a lot of things that we might consider to be good hints and tips about how to best manage that. So I felt a bit of responsibility to try and share some of that information. So together with some colleagues, we set up a web resource which provides evidence-based strategies, particularly for remote workers, to support them in both getting their work done and disengaging from work at the end of the day in order to recover. And we made that advice free for anyone who wanted to access it. And we linked that with a citizen science project, so that in return for people completing a questionnaire for us about their experience of working at home and the whole transitioning to that situation, we gave them guidance about which of our strategies that we'd put up we thought was most likely to be of help to them. And between about the 20th of April and the 20th of May, we got responses from 350 people, and many of them were academics and research students. And the challenges that they told us about fell into three themes. The first one was finding a workplace, like somewhere to work in their home. The second was a lack of connection to others. And the third was actually getting work done. So I'm just going to go through those three things a little bit to give you a bit of an idea about the sorts of things that they said. So in terms of the workspace setup, people had real problems finding a physical space in which to work, because unsurprisingly, not everybody lives in a mansion with space for a dedicated home office. And so we found that many people, even if they did have that kind of space in their home, they hadn't anticipated they might need that space available for every member of the household. So people who are living in shared space, shared homes might need multiple spaces for working. Families needed spaces for both the adults and their children who were trying to do schoolwork from home. So some people really struggled with living in small spaces. We had a quote here from someone who says that they live in a single room with their partner. They both needed space to work, and that work involved things like writing, but also phone calls. And doing that in the same space as someone else was incredibly difficult. But one particular difficult they told us about was using that same space for both work and relaxation. So here we have a quote from one of our participants saying, "Monday mornings are very difficult because I spend Sunday relaxing there, and then I return to exactly the same location on Monday and I have to try and change my mentality to work thinking." So you can see how just the physical space presented its own challenges. Now, the second challenge was this lack of connection to others. So at the same time as many people felt that they were spending too much time on Zoom connecting with others, they felt like the quality of that connection wasn't enough. So they had too little time properly connecting with others. And when they'd spent most of their day in Zoom meetings, they couldn't face spending more time in the evening on Zoom trying to have a chat with someone. And people found video meetings really difficult. The absence of the body language cues that we use when we're talking to people that help us work out turn taking and when could I butt in here and say something. All of those cues have disappeared, and they make video calls actually really fatiguing. So we had someone saying that I really felt zoomed out. At the end of the day of multiple Zoom calls, I couldn't be bothered to engage with friends via a social Zoom call. But people also missed the sort of casual water cooler chats, the opportunities for going lunch with their colleagues, or the chance to catch up at the end of the day. And this loss of sort of like everyday ad hoc communication made it difficult to get work done, as well as removing that social interaction. Because these conversations are not only opportunities for us to get that social connection and sort of like allay feelings of loneliness, but they also are ways in which we get really useful information. So sometimes if we're finding something difficult and we chat to a colleague about it, they can say, "Oh, well, I did that last year and I can give you a copy of what I did." Maybe that will serve as inspiration. So these sorts of informal conversations, they really help us to get our work done, and they help us to create these kind of really strong working relationships with each other that help us develop as a team. So the third struggle then was actually getting work done. So it wasn't just this kind of loss of information from not having people around, but working at home was hard. People had to deal with a whole load of new distractions. We were used to the distractions from working in shared offices and from our digital communications, but on top of that, we had new things to deal with. We had noise from neighbours. We had interruptions from delivery drivers. Several people found it really hard to ignore their home-related responsibilities. So when they're trying to focus on work, they talked about how they found it very easy to kind of divert their attention onto something that was more home-based, like getting the washing up done. And they were also really distracted by the situation they found themselves in. And they reported spending lots of time looking at the news. So these distractions and interruptions meant that their working day, wasn't satisfactory. They didn't feel like they got enough done by the end of the day. And so they worked on longer. So it extended their work days with them feeling like they could never get away from work anyway. And that led to increased feelings of stress and exhaustion, which in turn make it really difficult the next day to get any work done because you're just too tired to do anything. So they found themselves in this vicious cycle of always being at work because work is now in the home, but never having the opportunity to properly recover from it, and therefore never feeling really productive. Now, interestingly, I think that playing games offer us a solution to 2 out of the 3 of these problems. Now, unfortunately, games aren't going to magically find us some extra space for a home office, but the other 2 I think they can do something about. So when we're finding it difficult to connect with other people remotely, I think games can help us to create teams who trust each other and cooperate effectively. And even though doing a PhD can often feel like a really lonely pursuit, many students are part of a wider team of people who are going through the same sort of thing and can offer us advice and support. They can give us useful resources, or they can just, hold our hand and give us a bit of moral support on something. So finding ways to really connect with them is important. And I think also when we feel like we're not getting anywhere with our work, or we're just really tired because we've worked really hard, games give us a great opportunity to disconnect from work and recover from work-related stress. So in the rest of this talk, I want to just tell you about some of the studies that we've done that provide evidence for these 2 claims that I'm making. So first, I'm going to tell you about 2 bits of work that I've done where we've used games to help create connections between people who could be in a work context. So the first one was work done with Emily Collins and Frank Lee, and using a game called Flashbulb. And this game was a simple icebreaker game that aimed to help people at academic conferences to network. Now, it's kind of funny talking about this when we're here in a virtual space, but in a physical location, often what we're trying to do at a conference is just meet new people and make new connections. And that means we have to kind of walk up to people and start talking. And we might be trying to do that in Gathertown over, today and tomorrow as well, like make new connections and meet new people. But many people really find this kind of connection, this kind of networking, quite a stressful aspect of academic life. And we thought that actually if we could create a game to support this, it might make things a bit more playful. It might kind of like help us deal with the awkwardness of that thing. Now, there are social networking games, like games that people often use in these sorts of situations to try to break the ice. And they require you as part of the game to interact with other people. So they don't really bypass that stressful part of networking. In fact, they kind of force you into it. But when we look at lots of other games we might play for fun, there's often an opportunity to interact with players in a way that doesn't seem to cause us those same feelings of stress. So with these kind of ideas in mind, Frank came up with the idea for Flashbulb and developed this as a mobile game. So in this game, you play this on your mobile phone whilst you're in the conference venue, and you're randomly assigned a target, and you have to go and find that person and take and submit a photograph of them in order to progress through the game. And players can choose whether to take the photo from a distance, perhaps in secret, or whether to use this as an opportunity to kind of start a conversation with that person. So we deployed this game in two different situations. We did this with academics at the Play conference, and also with students in an induction section at the start of the academic year at UCL. And then we interviewed people afterwards to find out how they found this game. Now, they told us that despite the fact that the game didn't require them to actually talk to others, it was really successful in encouraging networking, and it broadened the scope of the kinds of people and the number of people that they think they otherwise would have spoken to. So the act of photographing other people kind of gave them a way to start conversations without kind of having to deal with this sort of like awkwardness of just walking up to someone and introducing yourself. Players also told us that they felt that part of its success was because it fitted really with the situation in which we deployed it, the type of game it was, who they were trying to network with. So the fact that the whole purpose of the session, if you like, or the purpose of being at a conference was to meet other people, and that there was dedicated time or opportunities in the day for them to play it. But I don't think we could just take this game and put it in GatherTown. I just don't think that that's quite going to work for us. So it really relies on people being physically co-located. And it also doesn't really help us deal with situations where we're trying to develop something more than that kind of initial connection with other people. Because in that situation, we're trying to do more than just meet someone. We want to build a stronger relationship with them. So, given the challenges that we face at the moment in terms of meeting face-to-face, I think still thinking about how we can build those sort of relationships online is something that's really useful for us to do. So in this second study, I want to talk to you about some work that I did with Evelyn Tan. So she is an iGGi PhD student, and you might have seen her this morning at the introduction session. And we had the opportunity to work together when she was studying for her master's degree at UCL. And this is work that we presented at Play in 2019. So we were interested in how we could use games to help teams to develop these kinds of trusting relationships more successfully than the sort of typical icebreakers that I've already mentioned. And we thought that this was interesting to do in remote work contexts, because these relationships would have to be developed entirely online. So, for example, if you're a PhD student who started your PhD in the middle of a pandemic, this is probably how you've had to get to know people. So we wanted to know, like in that kind of context, or with just distributed remote teams, could a game really help people to develop these sorts of relationships better? So we know that looking at how people develop deep social bonds through games ordinarily, that often develops over a longer period, over weeks and months. And one of the things we were really keen to do is to see, could we find some measurable impact in a really short amount of time, so that we could think about whether this was something we might recommend to teams, for example. And when we looked at the literature, we could see that while several studies had begun to explore what was kind of possible in this context, they'd only really used survey measures of trust. So although there was some evidence that that playing games like this might increase people's willingness to trust other people, to be a bit more vulnerable, there's no evidence that we could really see this play out in people's behavior. So in our study, we created virtual teams of strangers, and then we had them interact with each other over a video call using Google Hangouts. And in teams of 4, they either completed a traditional icebreaker activity or they played a game called Space Team. Now, Space Team is a mobile game in which you are assigned a random control panel. So it has buttons and switches and sliders and dials. And you also get given time-sensitive instructions. And those instructions are different for every player. And the instructions might not relate to what's on your control panel. So critically, you look at the instruction, you might think, oh, I can do that on this panel. Or you think there's nothing on here that means I'm going to be able to do this, and I need to get one of my teammates to do it. So you end up shouting these weird things like grease the pro rods at other people, hoping that someone else will hear you and be able to do this. So whilst it certainly takes a couple of seconds before people feel really comfortable yelling at each other, we could see that this was the type of game that the literature at least would suggest created a context where people might be able to develop these sorts of bonds, might be able to strengthen those sort of bonds between people. So after playing the game or taking part in just like one of those traditional icebreaker activities, we then had the teams take part in a game of Day Trader. And this is a type of prisoner dilemma game where there's a conflict between what might be the best action for an individual to do and the best action for the group to do. And so we thought this would be a good test for what had happened as the outcome of this experience, because we thought that if the game really did help to develop these bonds, we would see more people in the teams that had played the game behave in a way that was in the group's best interests rather than in their own best interests. And that's exactly what we did see, that the teams were much more likely to cooperate in Day Trader if they played the Space Team game than if they played the traditional icebreaker game. So it definitely seems like these games can enable us to develop these stronger working relationships. So now let's focus on that second situation in which I said that I thought games might help support PhD students. So in order to get things done, to deal with that long list of things that PhD students have to do, we have to be able to bring our best selves. So someone who is well rested and recovered from stresses and strains of their last workday are now best able to put their energy into work. So to recover from those stresses and strains, we need to engage in recovery activities. And those are things that help us to psychologically detach, so put work aside and not think about it. They help us relax, so they bring down our arousal to a healthy level. They experience mastery, and they help us experience mastery over challenges that are put to us, and they help us to feel in control over our environment. And lots of hobbies are really helpful in helping us to do these sorts of things. Reading books and watching movies, as an example, can help you to detach and relax, but games help you to do all 4 of these things. So in this work that I conducted with Emily Collins, we were interested to see whether some types of games might be better for supporting recovery than others. We surveyed nearly 500 people, and we found that the total number of hours playing games per week was positively correlated with overall recovery. And we also found that those correlations varied with genre. So first-person shooters and action games were more highly correlated with recovery than some of the others. And so this suggests that there might be some game characteristics that might be more important for this sort of relationship. And in fact, when we were looking at those, the subset of gamers who said they developed online relationships with others, we saw that online social support mediated this relationship. So this gives us a clue that perhaps games with a social element are likely to be more useful in this regard. But this was just a correlation. So we wanted to know whether games really could have an impact on people in this way. And to address that, we conducted a series of experiments, which we published in 2019. The first one was a lab experiment, and we first of all gave people a need for recovery. So we gave them this horrible maths task to do so they'd feel a bit stressed out. And then we put them in one of three groups. They either had a digital game to play, or they had engaged with a mindfulness app, or we gave them a non-media control, which was like a fidget spinner. So just a little physical toy to sit and play with for 10 minutes. And in our second study, we wanted to take that out of the lab and into the real world. So we replicated those first two conditions, so the digital game and the mindfulness app, with participants who were working professionals. And we asked them to play or to engage with the app for 10 minutes at the end of each working day for a period of 5 working days. So in our lab study, we found the digital game condition improved recovery, whereas the other two conditions had a decrease. And then when we looked at what happened in the world in our second study, we saw that the daily recovery experience increased during the course of the study for those who played the digital game, but it decreased for those in the mindfulness condition. So we talked to our participants afterwards, and those who played the game told us about how the game helped them to disengage from work. So they really talked about these feelings of detachment and restoration. They told us that there were daily differences. So on days when they'd had a really busy day, they found it particularly beneficial to play. And the third thing was around kind of routine or scheduling. So of course, being part of our study meant that they'd set aside this 10 minutes a day to engage in this activity. And they really felt that this was useful, this idea of having this time to transition from one activity, from like work life into home life. And certainly, whilst I've been working at home, sometimes the only thing that's between my work and my home life is a curtain I could pull to sort of hide my desk. And in situations like that, having a daily behavioural practice, so 10 minutes in which we do a particular thing, can really help us to just disengage from work. So in conclusion, I encourage you to play more games. Play games with your colleagues to strengthen your relationships with them. Play games with new PhD students. It's a really good way to try to build your relationships with people who you haven't met before. If you're involved in teaching, you might look for opportunities to play games with those students. You could get them to play Space Team together, for example. And also make sure you schedule time off. Make plans to play games with your friends and family. It helps you to disconnect and recover from work. It makes you a better PhD student, and it could be a fun way to strengthen your relationships. So thanks very much for your attention.